It all started with bubbles, thousands of them, cascading over the rim of my pool like a frothy tidal wave, spilling across the deck and creeping toward my lawn. I stood there, barefoot on the cool concrete, blinking at the surreal sight. At first, I thought I'd lost my mind. Had I dropped too many chlorine tablets in last night? Was this some freak chemical reaction I'd never heard of? The air smelled faintly of lavender and bleach, a bizarre combo that made my nose wrinkle. But then I saw it, sudsy streaks trailing away from the pool, a chalky white residue smeared across the pavement, and a shadowy figure caught in the grainy glow of my security camera footage. There she was, in all her infuriating glory, Linda, the self-appointed dictator of the HOA, dumping an entire box of industrial-strength detergent into my pool. My jaw dropped as I watched her on the tiny screen, her movements deliberate, almost gleeful. She shook the empty container over the water, ensuring every last grain dissolved into what had been my pristine backyard oasis. Then, as if she hadn't just committed an act of suburban sabotage, she strutted off, her sensible loafers clicking against the pavement like she'd done the neighborhood a public service. A wave of rage boiled up inside me, so hot I could feel it pulsing in my temples. I clenched my fists so hard my knuckles turned white. This wasn't Linda's first overreach, but it was personal now. She'd invaded my space, my sanctuary. For months, she'd been after me, citing ridiculous HOA violations despite the fact that my house wasn't even part of her precious association. My crime? Refusing to bow to her petty tyranny. She'd find me for the wrong shade of patio chairs. Apparently, sage green wasn't community approved. My mailbox, a perfectly functional black one, wasn't standardized, so that earned me another citation. And my lawn? Too natural, she'd said, sneering at the wildflowers I'd let grow instead of dousing the yard in chemicals to mimic a golf course. I'd ignored her letters, tossed her fines in the trash, and figured she'd eventually tire herself out. Clearly, I'd underestimated her vindictiveness. The doorbell jolted me out of my spiraling thoughts. It was Ryan, my best friend, and the only person I'd trust to witness my impending meltdown without judgment. He stepped inside, took one look at the foamy disaster spilling across my deck, and nearly doubled over laughing. "Dude, did you install a hot tub overnight and forget to invite me?" he wheezed, bracing his hands on his knees. His dark hair flopped into his eyes, and he swiped it back, still grinning like a kid who'd stumbled into a prank war. I glared at him, then thrust my phone in his face, the security footage already queued up. "Linda." His laughter cut off like a switch had been flipped. He grabbed the phone, squinting at the grainy video, and let out a low whistle. "Oh, she's really outdone herself this time." His voice was equal parts awe and amusement, but I could see the gears turning behind his hazel eyes. "Yeah, I'm about 5 seconds from turning her yard into a swamp," I growled, pacing the kitchen. My bare feet slapped against the tile, leaving damp prints from the pool water I'd tracked in. Ryan stroked his chin, pretending to weigh the idea like some philosopher pondering life's great questions. Tempting thought, man, but let's go bigger. I stopped mid-step, frowning. "Bigger?" A slow, mischievous grin spread across his face. "HOA meetings today, right?" My breath caught as my mind leapt ahead. Linda would be there, perched on her throne of self-righteous authority, dictating her latest decrees to a room full of miserable homeowners. She probably assumed I'd just stew in silence, too embarrassed or exhausted to fight back. That was her first mistake. By the time we pulled into the community center parking lot, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows over the squat brick building. Inside, the room was packed, rows of folding chairs filled with neighbors, some slouched like prisoners serving a life sentence, others wearing forced smiles to stay on Linda's good side. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and desperation. At the front, Linda stood like a queen addressing her court, her sleek brunette bob unmoving despite the ceiling fan whirring overhead. She clutched a clipboard like it was a scepter, her navy blazer crisp and her voice sharp as a blade. "As I was saying," she announced, her tone dripping with sanctimony, "we must enforce stricter visual standards for our community. There have been violations." Her eyes flicked to me with the subtlety of a car alarm, lingering just long enough to make her point. "Some people believe they're above the rules." I raised my hand, cutting through the murmurs. "I have a question. Linda sighed, a dramatic exhale that suggested I'd already ruined her day. Yes, Ethan, she said, her voice tight with impatience. I stood, holding up my phone like a weapon. Would you say dumping industrial-strength detergent into someone's private pool qualifies as a violation? A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd, heads turning to gauge Linda's reaction. Her smile didn't falter, but her fingers twitched slightly, gripping the clipboard tighter. I don't know what you're implying, she said smoothly, waving a dismissive hand. But if you're referring to that little incident with your pool, I was merely helping maintain neighborhood cleanliness. You should thank me, really. I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to stay level despite the heat rising in my chest. I have security footage of you doing it. The whispers turned into muffled chuckles from the back of the room. Folks who'd long since stopped drinking Linda's Kool-Aid. Her expression held steady, but I caught it, the tiniest flicker of panic behind her hazel eyes. Security footage can be misleading, she replied, her tone as polished as ever. And let's not forget, your pool has been a topic of concern for months. Perhaps this is a sign you should redesign it to better fit community standards. Ryan, slouched beside me with his arms crossed, muttered under his breath, "Oh, she's good. Evil but good." I exhaled sharply through my nose, resisting the urge to snap. So, just to clarify, you think dumping soap into my private pool was justified because you don't like how it looks? Linda's lips pressed into a thin line, her patience visibly fraying. I think we should focus on the bigger picture here. I turned to the crowd, raising my voice. Raise your hand if you think Linda's completely full of, all right, that's enough, she snapped, cutting me off. If you have an issue, Ethan, you're welcome to file a complaint through proper channels. Ryan snorted beside me. Like you actually process complaints that aren't your own. A few quiet laughs slipped out from the back, and Linda straightened, regaining her composure like a general rallying her troops. If there's nothing else, I'd like to move on to the next agenda item. I gritted my teeth, sinking back into my chair. She was slipping away again, untouchable as always. But then Ryan leaned over, his eyes glinting with mischief. You know, he murmured, if you drain that pool right, all that soap's got to go somewhere. I blinked at him, the words sinking in. A grin slowly spread across my face. Linda wanted to play dirty? Fine. I could play dirtier. Draining a pool isn't exactly a stealth mission, but with the right setup, it can be subtle enough. That's what I told myself as I stood in the dark, the night air crisp against my skin, staring at the hose snaking from my pool toward Linda's perfectly manicured lawn. Ryan crouched beside me, his grin wide and infectious, watching the first trickle of soapy water seep into the ground. I hadn't even kicked the full drain into gear yet, but I could already picture Linda's face when she woke up to her pristine grass drowning in bubbles. It was poetic justice, beautiful, petty, and just a little terrifying. If she caught me, she'd turn this into a suburban crime saga worthy of a Netflix docuseries. The plan was simple. My pool, now a bubble factory thanks to Linda's stunt, had to be emptied anyway. Draining it onto my own yard wasn't an option unless I wanted a swamp of my own, so the next logical target was the source of the mess, Linda's lawn. The hose was angled just right, a steady, quiet flow, not enough to raise alarms, but enough to soak deep into the roots of her award-winning flower beds. Those beds had been her pride and joy, the crown jewel of her 5-year streak as best lawn champ. Ryan nudged me, his voice low. It's really working. Think she'll notice right away? I smirked, adjusting the hose. She'll notice when the sun's up and she steps outside expecting perfection, but finds a soap-covered disaster instead. We settled back against the deck chairs, letting the plan unfold. The night was still, the hum of the draining water almost soothing. I half expected Linda to burst out of her house like a suburban Sith Lord, sensing a disturbance in her domain. But the street stayed quiet, her windows dark. It was almost too easy. The next morning, chaos erupted. It started with shouting, loud, screeching, Linda-level shouting that rattled the block. I dragged myself out of bed, rubbing sleep from my eyes, and shuffled to the window. There she was, standing in the middle of her lawn, arms flailing like a windmill gone rogue. Her once immaculate yard looked less like a landscape paradise and more like an overflowing bubble bath. The foam had spread beyond my wildest hopes, not just soaking her grass, but spilling onto the sidewalk and creeping toward neighboring houses. A pack of kids from down the street had already found it, leaping into the thick patches of suds like it was a snow day. Ryan burst through my front door seconds later, breathless from laughing. "Dude, have you seen it? It's worse than we thought." I followed him outside, and that's when I grasped the full scope of the mess. The detergent hadn't just wrecked Linda's lawn. It had flowed downhill, pooling into at least 4 other yards. White suds clung to fences, flower beds, and porches, turning the street into a slapstick comedy set. The neighborhood was now a giant bubble party, and Linda was losing her mind at the epicenter. She spotted me instantly, her eyes locking onto mine like heat-seeking missiles. Her face was an unnatural shade of red as she stormed across the soapy street, slipping once but catching herself before face-planting. "You!" she shrieked, jabbing a finger at me. "This is your doing." I plastered on my best look of confusion, though I could feel Ryan vibrating with suppressed laughter beside me. "My doing, Linda? I woke up to this mess just like everyone else. What exactly are you accusing me of?" She flailed her arms, pointing at the devastation. "You drained your disgusting pool onto my property. Do you know how much damage this could cause? My lawn, my flowers, my irrigation system." A dark, satisfied part of me wanted to remind her she'd started this war by dumping soap in my pool. Instead, I raised an eyebrow. "Seems like karma to me. That was the wrong move." Her face turned an even deeper crimson, and she let out a frustrated scream. "You're going to pay for this. I'm calling the HOA, the city, and the police. This is destruction of property." I sighed, crossing my arms. "Linda, I just drained my pool. If that soapy water somehow ended up on your lawn, well, that's an unfortunate coincidence." She shrieked again, then stormed off, already dialing numbers on her phone. By the time the city inspector arrived, the scene had escalated. The foam had spread further, some drifting onto the main road. The kids were still playing, their parents too entertained to intervene. A few neighbors snapped photos, probably stockpiling evidence for the inevitable Linda must go petition. The inspector was a weary-looking guy in his 50s, the kind who'd seen enough HOA nonsense to last a lifetime. He listened to Linda's frantic rant, his face blank as she gestured wildly at her ruined yard. When he turned to me, he sighed. "Sir, did you drain your pool onto her lawn?" I kept my expression neutral. "I drained my pool, yeah? Where the water went after that. I can't control gravity." Ryan snorted so hard I thought he'd choke. The inspector pinched the bridge of his nose, pulling out a notepad. "Technically, there's no ordinance against draining pool water, but considering," he waved at the foamy chaos, "I'll need to look into it." Linda crossed her arms, smirking like she'd won. "Finally, arrest him." The inspector gave her a long, unamused look. "Ma'am, this isn't a criminal matter. At worst, it's a civil dispute." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish, thrown off by the lack of instant justice. Ryan whispered, "I love how she thought you'd be hauled off in cuffs over soap." I fought back a grin. "Yeah, real high-stakes crime." The inspector scribbled a few more notes. "I'll file a report, but unless there's major property damage beyond some lawn issues, this doesn't warrant more action." Linda made a strangled noise, her frustration hitting a fever pitch. "This is an attack. A coordinated attack on my property." Before the inspector could respond, Ryan, who'd been fiddling with his phone, let out a triumphant laugh. "Oh man, this just keeps getting better. Ethan, you're gonna love this." I glanced at him, confused. "What?" He turned his phone around, showing me something that made my stomach flip in the best way possible. Linda's been breaking the law this whole time. Her smugness vanished as she caught sight of the screen, her confidence crumbling like a house of cards. Ryan had struck gold. He'd dug up property records, water usage reports, and buried neighborhood complaints Linda had suppressed. For years, she'd been illegally siphoning city water into her irrigation system, bypassing regulations and dodging bills. The evidence was damning. An unauthorized underground connection pulling thousands of extra gallons to keep her lawn emerald green. It wasn't just an HOA violation, it was straight-up theft. I looked up from the phone, savoring the moment as I met her gaze. "Linda," I said, dragging her name out just enough to watch her squirm. "You wouldn't know anything about illegal water use, would you?" Her hands clenched at her sides. "That's ridiculous." The The inspector, who'd been trying to stay neutral, straightened. What did you just say? Ryan, barely containing his glee, handed the phone over. She's been stealing water for years. That perfect lawn. Not from her award-winning gardening skills. She's been running an off-the-books water network. Linda's face turned ashen. That's a lie. You can't trust some conspiracy he found online. The inspector scrolled through the documents, his brow furrowing. These are public records, he muttered. City complaints, violation reports, meter readings that don't match usage. He looked at Linda, his polite facade gone. Ma'am, this is serious. Panic set in as she sputtered. This is harassment. They're making it up. Arrest them, not me. He ignored her, pulling out his radio. I need someone from the water department out here ASAP. Possible illegal siphoning. Linda's composure shattered. You can't do this, she shrieked. The neighbors, once amused by the soap fiasco, now whispered among themselves, realizing the woman who'd terrorized them with fines was the real criminal. Old mister. Grayson chuckled nearby. Guess the HOA queen's not as spotless as she thinks. Linda whirled on him, livid. You're all ungrateful. I built this neighborhood. I made it beautiful. By stealing from it. I asked, tilting my head. She let out another furious scream, pointing at me. This is your fault. You and your disgusting pool. If you'd followed the rules, none of this would have happened. Ryan laughed so hard he doubled over. She actually thinks she's the victim here. The next hour was a whirlwind. Water department workers arrived, digging into Linda's flower beds and finding the illegal pipes almost immediately. Hidden lines rerouted from a city main. It wasn't a minor slip-up, it was calculated theft, costing thousands over a decade. Linda's excuses spiraled. She claimed ignorance, blamed her late husband, then the previous homeowner, despite living there for 20 years. Each lie dug her deeper. The water official delivered the final blow. Ma'am, you've been flagged for unauthorized use for nearly a decade. That's tens of thousands in unpaid fees, plus potential fines. This'll require legal action. Linda paled. Legal action? The collective gasp from the crowd was almost comical. The HOA enforcers who'd once backed her began to peel away, murmuring. Someone muttered, we should vote her out. Ryan's eyes lit up. Now that's a twist I can get behind. Linda tried one last stand. You can't remove me. I am the HOA. A younger woman, fed up, crossed her arms. Not anymore, you're not. The crowd turned against her, their blank stares and nods sealing her fate. By day's end, Linda was stripped of her HOA title, slapped with a massive fine, and left standing in her ruined, sudsy lawn as the sun set. The foam had finally faded, but her pristine yard was a patchy mess. Ryan and I kicked back on my porch, beers in hand, watching the last city truck roll away. Well, Ryan said, taking a sip, that was an eventful day. I chuckled, stretching out. Think she learned her lesson? He snorted. Doubt it, but at least she's done bossing us around. I exhaled, a strange peace settling over me. The neighborhood felt lighter, freer. Then, across the street, Linda stood glaring at her wrecked lawn. I raised my beer in a silent toast to karma. Ryan clinked his bottle against mine. To the best pool revenge in history.